It began with a quiet tension that floated through Buckingham Palace like a ghost, unseen but deeply felt. Queen Camilla, once seen as a quiet presence behind the crown, had grown into a figure of power, influence, and silent resolve. She had watched the games unfold from the sidelines for too long, allowing others to shape the narrative. But things changed when whispers about Jasmine Crockett's secret meetings reached her ears. Jasmine wasn't royalty. She wasn't even officially in the royal circle. But her growing popularity among younger citizens and her sudden closeness to high-ranking political advisors set alarm bells ringing. Queen Camilla had faced battles before, internal family conflicts, media storms, and public opinion. But this was different. Jasmine wasn't attacking directly. She was rewriting the script slowly, subtly. She appeared on news shows praising new reforms, hinting at modernization, and carefully calling out the old systems without naming anyone. But everyone knew who she meant. Camilla represented those very traditions Jasmine sought to bypass. What made it more dangerous was that Jasmine's words resonated with many. She was careful, confident, and most importantly, underestimated by those in power. Until now. Camilla knew revenge didn't always have to be loud. Sometimes it had to be crafted like a poem, each line careful, intentional, and sharp enough to draw blood without screaming. Her first move wasn't public. It was a private invitation to Jasmine, one Jasmine couldn't refuse, a royal luncheon under the guise of unity and conversation. The Queen's team presented it as a way to show grace, inclusion, and bridge generations. The media loved it. Jasmine accepted, not realizing she was walking into a chamber of mirrors. The palace was dressed in quiet luxury the day Jasmine arrived. The air was heavy with formality, and the Queen, in her signature calm demeanor, welcomed her with polite distance. Their conversation began with smiles, but under the surface, it was a chess match. Every word Camilla spoke was layered. She complimented Jasmine's voice, then gently reminded her of the weight of history. Jasmine returned the favor by acknowledging tradition, but subtly pressing for progress. The Queen listened, nodding, never once showing discomfort. But behind her eyes, a storm was gathering. The meeting was a performance, but not for the cameras. It was for the Queen's advisors, her loyal aides, and the few who still held influence in the background. Watching the way Jasmine maneuvered gave Camilla exactly what she needed. Jasmine had ambition. She wanted something. And Queen Camilla's revenge would begin by finding out exactly what that was. As Jasmine left the palace that afternoon, smiling for the cameras and waving at the press, she thought she had made a strong impression. And she had, but not in the way she believed. Queen Camilla stood at her private window, watching the car pull away, already thinking 3 steps ahead. Jasmine's rise wasn't going to be easy anymore, not now. The Queen had taken her seriously, and when Camilla took someone seriously, they usually didn't see what hit them until it was too late. As the days passed after her visit to the palace, Jasmine Crockett grew more confident. Her appearance alongside Queen Camilla had boosted her visibility, and the press was buzzing about a new, modern voice standing shoulder to shoulder with the monarchy. Jasmine knew how to ride that wave. Behind the scenes, she met with influential figures, business owners, young activists, and even members of parliament who were hungry for a shift in tradition. Her plan wasn't to destroy the monarchy outright. It was to reshape it, to make it more reflective of the future rather than bound to the past. She launched what she called the People's Panel, a public outreach campaign that gathered opinions on the future of the monarchy and public service. On the surface, it seemed harmless, just listening to the people. But Camilla saw it differently. She understood how dangerous such a panel could become. Public opinion was powerful, and Jasmine was clever enough to stir emotions while appearing diplomatic. Queen Camilla recognized the same tactics used by those who had tried to weaken the monarchy before. Jasmine wasn't attacking the crown. she was making it look outdated. What disturbed the Queen more was that some royal staff had started praising Jasmine's ideas. Whispered conversations in the halls turned into quiet debates. A few aides even suggested bringing Jasmine on as a permanent advisor. Camilla didn't respond in anger. She watched, remembered names, and remained polite. She had lived through decades of storms. Diana, the tabloids, even the early resentment toward her marriage. And every time she had survived by being patient, composed, and strategic. Meanwhile, Jasmine grew bolder. She booked interviews across major networks and subtly suggested that change was needed at the highest levels. She smiled as she said it. She never named Camilla, but the message was clear. The monarchy needed fresh energy. To many viewers, it sounded like progress, but to Camilla, it sounded like a warning. In private, the Queen called upon her most trusted ally, an old advisor who had served under multiple monarchs. He wasn't flashy, but he understood power structures like no one else. She laid out Jasmine's pattern, her movements, her supporters, and her soft influence. The advisor studied the situation and quietly said, "She's building a palace of her own, brick by brick, right under your nose." That night, Queen Camilla didn't sleep. She sat in her study, surrounded by portraits of royals who had endured far worse. She thought deeply, not about how to stop Jasmine's ideas, but how to stop Jasmine's momentum. Because it wasn't the plan that was dangerous. It was the growing belief that someone like Jasmine could replace the quiet power of a queen with the loud voice of a crowd. That belief was spreading, and Camilla had to crush it before it spread too far. The next day, the Queen made a rare appearance at a youth charity event, a space Jasmine often dominated. Camilla didn't come to observe. She came to reclaim the narrative. Her speech was short but sharp. She spoke of service, sacrifice, and the burden of leadership, not just the charm. She didn't mention Jasmine once, but her message rang louder than any direct attack. True power wasn't in popularity. It was in permanence. The crowd gave polite applause, but some eyes flickered with doubt. The Queen had sent her first public message, wrapped in grace, but laced with warning. The stage was no longer Jasmine's alone. The Queen had stepped into the arena. Now it was a real contest, and Camilla was ready to fight in her own quiet, unshakable way. Jasmine Crockett began to notice the shift, though at first she dismissed it as background noise. The energy she had created was still alive. Her panels were drawing crowds, her interviews gaining millions of views, and her name was trending across platforms. But something felt off. Her team started reporting unexpected delays in scheduled appearances, changes in permissions, subtle pushback from organizations that had previously supported her movement. The warmth she had felt from media outlets started to cool, just slightly, but enough for her to notice. She didn't suspect Queen Camilla immediately. In Jasmine's mind, the Queen was a symbol, not an operator. She believed Camilla represented the past, not someone who would act with strategy. That misjudgment became her weakness. Because while Jasmine was planning her next step publicly, Camilla was working in the shadows, pulling strings quietly, not to destroy Jasmine, but to make her appear unsure, out of place, even reckless. Behind the scenes, Queen Camilla met with cultural leaders, longtime allies, and influential voices within the British establishment. She didn't speak about Jasmine directly. Instead, she asked questions about responsibility, legacy, and unity. Her presence alone sent a message. The Crown was paying attention. Those meetings didn't make headlines, but they did make people think. And slowly, the narrative around Jasmine started to shift. What once was seen as boldness began to be seen as impatience. Her ideas were called idealistic rather than visionary. Some pundits started questioning her qualifications. Camilla had successfully planted seeds of doubt, not by attacking, but by letting others arrive at the conclusions themselves. And when doubt grows slowly, it lasts longer. Jasmine sensed the pressure building. At a major live event meant to be her biggest platform yet, she stumbled during a speech. A question from the audience caught her off guard. Someone asked whether she truly respected the monarchy or was using her voice to climb higher. The question shouldn't have rattled her, but it did. Her response lacked the composure she was known for, and the media noticed. Headlines the next day didn't focus on her message. They focused on her reaction. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla watched it all unfold from Windsor, calm as ever. She understood the game. It wasn't just about winning, it was about letting your opponent lose themselves. Jasmine's strength had been her image of control, clarity, and charisma. The Queen's subtle pressure had created cracks in that image, cracks Jasmine couldn't see, but the world slowly could. Camilla didn't celebrate. This wasn't about ego, it was about defense. To her, Jasmine wasn't just a rising star, she was a disruption with no respect for foundation. The Queen had worked her entire life, endured decades of public opinion, and earned her place through quiet strength. She wasn't going to let someone with a quick voice and flashy presence rewrite what generations had built. Jasmine, on the other hand, now realized she was in a different kind of battle. This wasn't a political race. It was a royal war of presence, poise, and influence. And the Queen wasn't fading. She was rising. As her team scrambled to fix the damage, Jasmine finally asked the question she had avoided. "Is this Camilla's doing?" The silence in the room answered her. For the first time, Jasmine saw Queen Camilla not as a figure of the past, but as her most dangerous obstacle. And she knew now, revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it smiles while quietly closing the door. In the days that followed Jasmine's public stumble, Queen Camilla did not gloat. There were no leaks from her circle, no statements to stir the press. She simply continued her royal duties with elegance, showing up at charity events, visiting hospitals, and giving brief but meaningful interviews focused on service and unity. It was the same image she had always projected, but now it carried sharper contrast. Where Jasmine once seemed like the future, Camilla began to feel like the anchor. In uncertain times, people often looked for something that felt steady, not loud. Jasmine's campaign, still alive, started to feel heavier. Her advisors pushed harder, trying to regain momentum, suggesting bolder moves. One idea floated around, a public debate on monarchy reform, where she could directly challenge what she called outdated structures. It was tempting. Jasmine loved to speak. She believed deeply in her message, but something inside her hesitated. She had felt the Queen's quiet influence, like a shadow she couldn't shake. And though she had once thought Camilla irrelevant, she now saw her as someone capable of orchestrating change without ever raising her voice. Queen Camilla, meanwhile, was deep in preparation, not for a debate, but for an upcoming royal address. It wasn't common for her to take center stage in such events, but she knew the timing was perfect. Without ever naming Jasmine, she would remind the world why the crown endured. She would speak not as a reaction, but as a statement of presence. Her speech would be calm, rich in history, but open enough to sound progressive. Her words would invite reflection, not argument. And in doing so, they would draw a clear line between tradition and trend. When the day of the speech arrived, the nation watched. Camilla stood tall, draped in royal blue, and began with a story from her youth. She talked about duty, how it had never been easy, how it had often been misunderstood, and how real leadership often came not from changing everything, but protecting what matters most. She praised young voices and fresh ideas, but carefully added that those ideas must rise on a foundation of wisdom and respect, not ego. It was a masterclass in subtlety. The reaction was powerful. Across networks and platforms, people praised her dignity. Some even compared her words to the great speeches of Queen Elizabeth, calling her a guardian of the realm. Even those who had leaned toward Jasmine's message paused to reconsider. Camilla had not stopped Jasmine with force. She had done it with stillness, by standing so firm that Jasmine's movement began to lose shape around her. Jasmine watched the speech from a private room. Her expression remained calm, but her silence afterward said everything. She knew the speech wasn't just for the public, it was meant for her. The Queen had drawn a boundary without ever saying her name, and Jasmine, for all her ambition and sharp words, felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hesitation. Her next public appearance was subdued, her tone softer, her posture more careful. People noticed. They said she seemed tired, but what they didn't know was that she wasn't exhausted by the crowd. She was exhausted by the quiet power that surrounded her. Queen Camilla hadn't shouted, accused, or pointed fingers. She had simply stood still, letting the storm swirl and then pass, while she remained unmoved. With Jasmine's momentum visibly slowing, Queen Camilla turned her attention inward, gathering those within the royal institution who had once shown signs of wavering loyalty. These were the voices who had previously admired Jasmine's boldness, even suggesting a partnership between her and the palace. Camilla, however, didn't reprimand them. She welcomed them into quiet, intimate conversations. Dinners without cameras, private meetings in historical rooms lined with royal portraits. She reminded them, not through commands, but through reflection, what the crown truly represented. She asked questions that guided their own realizations. "What does it mean to serve?" she'd ask softly. "What are we protecting, and why?" By making them think instead of feel pressured, she pulled them back into her circle. Slowly, they began to echo her language in public. Support for Jasmine, once bold, now came with hesitant tones or long pauses. The Queen wasn't isolating Jasmine, she was reuniting everyone else. Meanwhile, Jasmine's team was growing tense. One advisor suggested she take a brief break to reset. Another argued for a major interview to regain control of the story. Jasmine, however, felt trapped between her original purpose and the weight of unexpected resistance. Her plan had been to move forward through inspiration, to bring change through excitement and support. But now she felt she had to prove herself just to hold ground. Worse, there were rumors. Whispers that a few within Parliament who once admired her were now being courted by the Queen's allies. Jasmine hadn't anticipated such a deep defense from Camilla. She had expected resistance, yes, but not this kind of disciplined, elegant counterplay. She had misread her opponent. What she thought was a figurehead had turned out to be a strategist, a protector who defended not with outrage, but with quiet precision. Camilla's next move was symbolic but significant. She visited a university known for progressive thought, one that had previously invited Jasmine for a keynote. Camilla didn't go to oppose Jasmine's legacy. She went to speak to the same students, to share her version of responsibility, balance, and growth. Her words didn't reject progress, they honored it, but with a reminder: evolution must not come by dismissing the past, but by building from it. The visit was met with admiration. Even students who supported Jasmine found Camilla's words hard to reject. Jasmine's public appeal began to divide. Some still saw her as a rising figure, while others now described her as too confrontational, too quick to rewrite what they barely understood. That shift didn't come from anything Jasmine had done recently. It came from everything Camilla had done quietly. The Queen had let time and presence do the work. Jasmine began to feel it in personal ways. Invitations slowed. Messages from allies came with less energy. The public stopped hanging on her every word. She was still respected, but now more as a cautionary tale than a fresh leader. It wasn't failure, it was transformation, and it wasn't the one Jasmine had planned. Queen Camilla stood firm, watching the change unfold without claiming victory. This wasn't about winning. It was about preserving something she knew would not survive chaos. Her revenge wasn't loud, but it was effective. It came not in striking Jasmine down, but in turning the world so gently that Jasmine lost her direction all on her own. Jasmine Crockett sat in her office, the walls once filled with hopeful strategies and future projections now cluttered with questions. Her inner circle, though still loyal, had grown quiet. The buzz that had once surrounded her movement now felt distant. She stared at the latest headlines, none directly criticizing her, but most of them subtly celebrating Queen Camilla's poise, strength, and grace in uncertain times. The message was clear. The public was choosing steadiness over disruption. But Jasmine wasn't one to quit. She decided to push back one more time, not with a speech or an event, but with a documentary. Her team had been filming her journey for months, capturing behind-the-scenes footage, her meetings with citizens, her emotional highs and lows. She thought this would be the perfect counterattack, a way to show her sincerity, her vision, and her truth. It was to be her most personal piece yet, a final statement in her own words. The documentary aired with much anticipation. It was well edited, visually strong, and deeply emotional. Jasmine spoke about her upbringing, her desire to make a difference, and her dreams for a more inclusive, modern monarchy. But something felt off, not in the content, but in the timing. The Queen had already captured the public mood. People weren't looking for another voice in a battle. They were looking for peace, unity, and someone who made them feel secure. The reviews of the documentary were mixed. Some praised her courage, but others said it came too late. A few even questioned the authenticity of releasing such a personal story right after the Queen's national address, seeing it as a strategic rather than sincere move. Jasmine felt the sting. Her truth was real, but the audience's focus had shifted. Queen Camilla, when asked about the documentary in an informal press moment, offered only a soft smile and a calm reply. Every voice matters, but every story needs time to mature. She didn't dismiss Jasmine. She didn't criticize her. She simply placed herself above the conflict, and in doing so, strengthened her image even more. This subtle response became a sensation. Clips of Camilla's brief comments spread across social media with captions like, "This is grace," and "True leadership speaks quietly." The Queen had struck again, not with power, but with presence. Jasmine realized something painful in that moment. She had brought all her energy, passion, and message to the table, but the Queen never played the same game. While Jasmine tried to lead a revolution, Camilla reminded the world that not everything needed to be rebuilt. Some things needed to be held steady. Jasmine's advisors started looking at other directions, perhaps a shift into education or policy advocacy, places where her ideas could grow slowly without the spotlight. She didn't disagree. Something inside her accepted that she had reached the edge of her current path. She had spoken loudly, but the Queen had spoken last. And that, in the world of quiet power, made all the difference. For Queen Camilla, there was no celebration. She didn't declare victory. She returned to her schedule, supporting community programs, hosting royal functions, walking slowly through crowds with a calm hand wave. The revenge, if it could be called that, was complete. Not because Jasmine was destroyed, but because the world no longer looked to her for direction. The Queen had stopped her plans, not by fighting, but by enduring. As the storm began to settle, Queen Camilla found herself once again surrounded by calm, but it was a calm she had earned. In the quiet halls of the palace, everything looked the same, yet the energy had shifted. What had once been a silent tension surrounding Jasmine's rise had now become a story of preservation. Camilla hadn't just protected the crown, she had reminded the world why it still mattered. And now, with Jasmine's voice softening in the public space, Camilla faced a different kind of responsibility, the one that follows after a battle is won. She didn't view Jasmine as an enemy. In fact, Camilla respected her drive, her charisma, and her ability to inspire a generation. But the Queen had known that ambition without discipline could threaten the very fabric of something as delicate as the monarchy. Camilla had learned through years of quiet observation, scandal, and scrutiny that not all change is progress, and not all boldness is leadership. Sometimes, power needs patience more than it needs applause. In a private conversation with the same senior advisor who had once warned her about Jasmine, Camilla spoke softly. She had fire, but no roots. The advisor nodded. They both understood that Jasmine's passion had burned hot, but without understanding the depth of what she tried to reshape, her flame could never last. The monarchy wasn't just tradition. It was memory, sacrifice, history, carried forward one generation at a time. To uproot that without fully understanding it was not bravery. It was carelessness. Jasmine, on the other hand, had stepped back from the spotlight. Her public team was downsized, her schedule less demanding. She began focusing on community projects far away from the cameras. Schools, youth centers, and small town halls became her new audience. She no longer tried to challenge the palace. She tried to reconnect with her purpose. And while her followers still admired her, they too sensed the shift. This wasn't about changing the nation anymore. It was about finding her voice again, without turning it into a weapon. One day, unexpectedly, Queen Camilla received a handwritten letter. It was from Jasmine. The tone was respectful. There was no apology, but there was understanding. Jasmine wrote of what she had learned, how the fire in her had blinded her to the layers of history she had never truly known. She expressed hope, not for forgiveness, but for peace, a hope that in some way their stories might both exist in service of the people, just in different forms. Camilla read the letter twice before putting it away. She didn't respond, at least not publicly, but privately, she had the palace archives store the letter as a part of modern royal correspondence. She believed the story mattered, not just hers, but Jasmine's too, because legacy wasn't just about the victor, it was about the lessons that came from near defeat. That evening, Queen Camilla walked through the royal gardens alone, her presence steady and quiet. The flowers, the stone paths, the silence, it all reflected her rule, measured, controlled, full of history and strength that didn't need to scream to be felt. She knew the future would always bring challengers, voices eager to change the world in their own way. But as long as she held the crown, it would never be taken through noise. It would have to be earned through endurance. Weeks passed, and the world slowly moved on. The media, once consumed with the Queen versus Jasmine narrative, shifted its attention to newer headlines. Yet within the quiet corners of power, within universities, political rooms, and royal circles, the story remained a topic of subtle discussion. It wasn't about who won or lost anymore. It had become a lesson, one wrapped in diplomacy, timing, and restraint. And at the center of that lesson stood Queen Camilla, a woman the world had once underestimated. Jasmine Crockett's name was no longer at the center of debates. She had chosen a path of reflection, taking her presence off major platforms and into local spaces. There, she found something she had been missing during her rise: truth without the need for control. Her connection with communities was still strong, but now it was quieter, more sincere. She spoke less about reform and more about listening. She realized that real change took more than passion. It required understanding the roots of what you hoped to change. She gave talks not as the bold reformer, but as someone who had touched the edge of influence and come back more aware. She no longer denied her ambition, but she also no longer chased public affirmation. The fire in her had cooled into something more focused. She had learned that impact wasn't always measured by how loudly one speaks, but sometimes by how deeply one understands silence. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla's presence became more respected than ever before. Her ability to stand firm without ever raising her voice had impressed even her former critics. Political analysts began studying her approach as a case in subtle leadership. Young royals who once felt disconnected from her now admired the way she had handled a cultural wave without ever needing to fight back directly. She had used grace as a defense and dignity as a sword. Behind palace walls, her influence grew even more. Her advice was sought for matters beyond ceremony, national charity policy, social unity projects, even youth engagement programs. The same groups that once considered Jasmine as their symbol now looked to the Queen for guidance. Not because she had changed herself, but because she had allowed others to come back to her without pushing them away. There was a moment, unplanned, soft, when their paths crossed again. At a memorial event for a late civic leader, both women arrived. Jasmine stood near the back, modest and respectful. Camilla, after her speech, turned and saw her. Their eyes met for just a moment. No words were exchanged, no photographers captured anything dramatic. But that single glance spoke more than a conversation. It wasn't cold, it wasn't triumphant. It was acknowledgement of battle, of growth, of understanding. Afterward, when asked about the event, Camilla said simply, "It's not always about who leads. Sometimes it's about who listens." And that was the difference. Jasmine had learned to listen. Camilla had always known when to speak. The public didn't need a reconciliation. They didn't need drama. They simply witnessed something rare, a quiet end to a loud chapter. In an age where power often came with shouting, Queen Camilla had proven that stillness could still win. And Jasmine, now walking a different road, carried that truth with her, not as a defeat, but as part of her becoming. By now, Queen Camilla's position was no longer questioned. It was quietly revered. The battle that had unfolded with Jasmine Crockett never became an official confrontation, but its impact lingered in the way people now looked at the monarchy. Instead of appearing outdated or fragile, it felt grounded, anchored by a woman who never needed to shout to be heard. Camilla had done something extraordinary. She had made tradition feel alive without changing its shape. She had taken a rising wave and let it crash against the walls of her patience, until it simply faded back into still water. For Jasmine, the reflection became her strength. She had once imagined herself as the face of transformation, but now she understood her role differently. She began mentoring young voices, not to lead revolutions, but to lead responsibly. Her speeches turned inward, focused more on what it meant to challenge systems without forgetting the humanity within them. Where once she might have declared the monarchy irrelevant, she now admitted that some institutions survive not because they resist change, but because they understand how to carry time within them. One of Jasmine's public talks made its way into the Queen's private study, sent by a former aide who thought Camilla would appreciate it. In it, Jasmine told a story about climbing too fast and missing the ground beneath her feet. She never mentioned the Queen's name, but the audience knew what she meant. "I learned," she said, "that if you don't understand what came before you, you're not building the future, you're just erasing the past." Camilla watched the clip in silence. When it ended, she gave the slightest nod. Not in triumph, but in respect. Behind the scenes, the Queen began encouraging younger royals to take on more responsibility. She didn't just hand over duties. She mentored them in how to lead from the quiet center, not the noisy edge. She told them that real power wasn't just in being seen. It was in being remembered for what you stood for when no one was looking. And they listened, because they saw in her not just a figurehead, but a master of patience and presence. Media outlets attempted several times to revive the tension between her and Jasmine, but neither woman took the bait. There were no more sharp responses, no more indirect interviews. The story had matured. and so had they. People eventually stopped asking about what had happened and started focusing on what had changed. The palace even saw a shift in its public reputation. Where once there were articles demanding a younger, bolder leadership, now there were columns reflecting on the value of emotional maturity and power. Camilla's choices had reshaped more than her own image. They had redefined the way people thought about leadership itself. It wasn't about dominance. It was about presence. Jasmine's journey continued away from the spotlight, but her name carried new weight. Not as a challenger to the crown, but as someone who had faced it, learned from it, and grown. Her legacy was still forming, and though it wouldn't sit beside Camilla's, it would forever be tied to it. 2 women, 1 crown. No war, just a test of silence versus volume. And in the end, the one who didn't raise her voice was the one who shaped the ending. Years later, the story of Queen Camilla and Jasmine Crockett became more than just a political moment. It turned into a study of how power shifts quietly in modern times. Schools, leadership seminars, and media retrospectives often referred back to it, not as a scandal or confrontation, but as a rare chapter where restraint, grace, and reflection guided the outcome. It was no longer about who was right or wrong. It became about how both women grew in ways no one had expected, including themselves. Queen Camilla, now older but ever poised, had become a symbol of quiet authority. Her presence at royal events felt earned, not expected. She had transitioned from a woman many had once judged unfairly to someone whose legacy was defined by endurance, subtle wisdom, and emotional intelligence. The crown she wore was not just physical. It was the invisible weight of history, decisions, and survival. And she had carried it with a calm the world would not forget. In her later years, Camilla wrote a memoir, not filled with dramatic revelations or secrets, but a collection of thoughts about public service, tradition, and the cost of being in the public eye. She didn't name Jasmine directly, but in one chapter titled The Beauty of Opposition, she wrote, "It's not our critics who weaken us. It is often our inability to understand them. If we listen, sometimes, even the strongest challenges reveal the strength within our own foundation." That line was quoted for years, often paired with images of the Queen standing firm while storms of criticism swirled around her. Jasmine Crockett, on the other hand, built a new kind of legacy. She never sought high office or chased titles again. Instead, she created a network of youth academies focused on teaching leadership, emotional discipline, and the importance of legacy. She told her students her story, not in bitterness, but with honesty. She admitted how much she had wanted to change the world, and how that desire had to be refined before it could be useful. "You don't rewrite history," she told them, "until you know why it was written the way it was." One day, a statue was unveiled in a London square. It wasn't of Queen Camilla or Jasmine individually, but a symbolic representation of balance. A woman standing tall, eyes closed, arms outstretched, not reaching to grab, but to hold. The plaque below read, "Inspired by those who lead without shouting and those who grow through challenge." The 2 names, Camilla and Jasmine, were engraved subtly at the base, not in competition, in connection. That moment, captured by news cameras and shared around the world, felt like closure, not because everything had been resolved, but because both figures had left something lasting behind. Queen Camilla had safeguarded tradition without fear. Jasmine Crockett had pushed against it and, in doing so, had helped reveal its true strength. Both had played their part. Both had transformed. Years from now, when young minds read about this chapter in history, they won't only ask who won. They'll ask what was learned. They'll study the silence between their words, the pauses before their actions, the dignity in how neither woman let it become a war. Because in the end, Queen Camilla didn't stop Jasmine's plans through force. She stopped them through clarity. And Jasmine, instead of being erased, became refined. Together, they reminded the world that real power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet strength to hold your ground and the grace to grow beyond it.